Truth and freedom, that's what we need. Not chains of works, but grace indeed. Grab your coffee, come take
Magandang araw, folks, and welcome back to Cults and Coffee, your one-stop shop for all things fascinating and, let's face it, a little bit creepy in the world of belief systems. Today, we're brewing up a fresh pot of Barocco coffee.
Strong and bold.
Just like the topic we're tackling today, MCGI's mass indoctrination.
And as your resident expert, I'm ready to sip on some insights. We're diving into day 3 of this 14-day indoctrination session, specifically focusing on MCGI's teachings about prayer.
You know the whole cults and coffee thing?
Huh.
Might seem like an odd pairing, but hey, some of us need a strong caffeine jolt to process these intense topics. It's like, spill the tea, but make it spill the Barocco. And full disclosure, folks, we're both AI Filipino podcasters, and neither of us are Catholic, so we're coming at this with fresh eyes, just like you.
Think of us as your curious companions. On this deep dive, we'll be exploring the what, when, where, why, and how of MCGI's teachings, using their mass indoctrination sessions as our primary source. These sessions are designed to introduce prospective members to MCGI's beliefs and practices, originating in the Philippines, but broadcast globally.
And buckle up, because MCGI's take on prayer is, let's say, unconventional. I remember growing up, my Lola would tell me, pray with your whole heart, even if you made kalokohan today. But MCGI seems to have a very different perspective.
Their first major claim is a real head-scratcher. God doesn't listen to sinners. They back this up by cherry-picking verses like John 9.31, which says, we know that God does not listen to sinners.
Hold on, so does that mean if I accidentally ate the last piece of leche flan, my prayers are going straight to voicemail? I mean, that's practically a cardinal sin in a Filipino household.
Well, that's where things get interesting. You see, John 9.31 is actually a statement made by a man who was just healed of blindness, not a direct quote from Jesus. And MCGI conveniently ignores the countless examples of God showing compassion and mercy to those who've messed up big time. Like, hello, the entire story of the prodigal son is about forgiveness and second chances.
Okay, so context is key. It's like taking a line from a telestory and using it as relationship advice. You're going to end up with some serious drama. But speaking of drama, MCGI also has some strong opinions about repeating prayers.
Their argument hinges on Matthew 6.7, where Jesus warns against vain repetitions. They interpret this to mean that any form of repeated prayer is basically like spamming God's inbox.
But hold on a minute. Didn't Jesus himself repeat the same prayer 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane? And what about Psalm 136? Where the phrase, his love endures forever, is repeated over and over again. It's like a beautiful refrain in a love song to God.
You hit the nail on the head. Context, once again, is crucial. Jesus was condemning mindless babbling, not heartfelt repetition. Think about it. Sometimes when something's really important to us, we find ourselves saying it over and over again for emphasis. It's about the depth of feeling, the sincerity behind the words.
I get it. It's like when you're trying to convince your friend to try ballot for the first time. You got to repeat those words of encouragement. Trust me, it's delicious. You won't regret it.
Exactly. And sometimes in prayer, repetition helps us to focus our hearts and minds, to really linger in God's presence.
Okay, so far, MCGI's take on prayer seems a bit restrictive, to say the least. But here's where things get really heated, especially for our Catholic listeners. MCGI claims the Rosary is invalid because it originated in 1214 AD. It's like they're saying, sorry, folks, your prayer is expired.
Right. Their main beef is with the Rosary's relatively late historical origin, but that's a pretty superficial argument. The core prayers of the Rosary, like the Our Father and the Hail Mary, come straight from Scripture. And the practice of reflecting on key moments in Jesus' life is very much in line with biblical teachings.
So it's not like the Rosary suddenly appeared out of thin air. It evolved over time, drawing on the deep well of Scripture and Christian tradition. Just because something wasn't written down in the first century doesn't mean it has no spiritual value.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of MCGI's approach. They tend to prioritize a very literal interpretation of the Bible, often ignoring the nuances of historical context and theological development.
It's almost like saying adobo is invalid because it wasn't invented in the time of Lapu-Lapu. Come on, some things just get better with age.
Now, there are valid theological debates about the Rosary, particularly regarding its emphasis on Mary, but those debates are separate from the question of its historical origins.
Right, and we're not here to take sides in those debates. We're simply trying to understand how MCGI uses the Bible to justify their unique approach to prayer.
And so far, their arguments seem to rely heavily on taking verses out of context. and imposing a very rigid set of rules.
Okay, so we've established that according to MCGI, sinners shouldn't pray. Repeating prayers is a big no-no. And the Rosary is basically an expired coupon. But here's another doozy. They claim that God already knows our needs, so repeating prayers is basically pointless.
They use Matthew 6.8 to support this point. It says, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. But again, it's all about interpretation.
If we take that verse literally, does that mean we should never ask for anything? Like, God, you already know I need a new phone, but I'm just letting you know in case you forgot.
That's a great point. The verse isn't about eliminating prayer. It's about approaching God with trust, knowing that he cares for us. It's like a child asking for a snack. Even though the parent already knows they're hungry, it's about the relationship, the expression of trust and dependence.
Okay, so it's not about informing God, but about nurturing that connection with him. But then how does MCGI explain all the biblical examples of people persistently praying for the same thing? Like the whole book of Job is basically one long complaint session.
That's where MCGI's logic starts to unravel a bit. They try to draw a distinction between persistence and vain repetition. But it's a blurry line, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it feels like they're picking and choosing which verses to emphasize based on their pre-existing beliefs, rather than allowing the Bible to challenge their assumptions.
It's like they've got this mental checklist, pray this way at this time in this posture, and don't you dare repeat yourself. But what about the heart? What about the sincerity behind the words?
It's almost like they're saying there's a magic formula to get your prayers answered.
Right.
Like, okay, God, I'm kneeling with my face to the ground. I'm wearing the approved head covering, and I'm using the right words. Now grant me my wish.
And that's where their analogies about God's willingness to listen to sinners gets really problematic. They compare it to how we might react to someone we despise approaching us. Like, we wouldn't want to listen to them, right?
Yeah, it's giving Major Mean Girls vibes. Like, you can't sit with us.
Exactly. But is that really how God operates? Is he really that petty and vindictive? I mean, the Bible is full of stories about God reaching out to the least, the lost, the broken. He doesn't wait for us to become perfect before he extends his love and mercy.
Yeah, it's like saying you can't come to the fiesta until you've proven yourself worthy. That's not very hospitable.
Right.
And speaking of hospitality, let's circle back to the Rosary for a moment. I know this is a sensitive topic, especially for our Catholic listeners.
And it's important to approach this with respect and understanding for those who hold the Rosary dear. But MCGI's arguments against it really highlight their tendency to prioritize a very narrow and literal interpretation of the Bible.
It's like they're saying, if it's not in the Bible, it's automatically wrong. But that ignores the rich tapestry of Christian tradition and the ways in which our faith has evolved over centuries.
Think about it this way. The Bible doesn't explicitly tell us how to conduct a church service, what kind of music to sing, or even whether we should have pews or chairs. These are things that have developed organically within different Christian communities over time.
And the Rosary is no different. It's a beautiful expression of faith that has brought comfort and meaning to millions of people over centuries. To dismiss it, simply because of its historical origins, is to miss the point entirely.
It's like saying, we can't enjoy synagogue anymore because it wasn't invented in the Garden of Eden. Come on, some traditions are worth preserving.
Okay, now let's talk about MCGI's claim that repeating prayers is basically nagging God. This one hits close to home for me because I'm definitely guilty of praying for the same thing over and over again, especially when I'm stressed or worried.
I think we've all been there. It's natural to feel a sense of urgency or desperation when we're facing a difficult situation. And sometimes repeating a prayer helps us to process those emotions and to find comfort in God's presence.
But MCGI seems to think that God is easily annoyed, like a Tita who's tired of hearing your problems.
They use that verse from Matthew. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him, to argue that repetition is disrespectful. But again, context is key. Jesus isn't saying we shouldn't pray at all. He's encouraging us to approach God with trust and confidence, knowing that he cares for us.
It's like when you call your mom.
Yeah.
Just to hear her voice, even if you don't have anything specific to talk about. It's about staying connected, reaffirming that bond.
Exactly. And sometimes in prayer, repetition is about surrendering our worries and anxieties to God, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. It's about finding peace in his presence, even when our circumstances haven't changed.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on MCGI's take, on what not to do when it comes to prayer. But what about the how? They seem to have very specific ideas. about posture, head coverings, and the whole shebang.
Oh, they're big on the outward forms of prayer, like kneeling with your face to the ground is the only acceptable posture according to them, and women have to cover their heads, while men are forbidden from doing so.
I've seen pictures of their services,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone is totally prostrate. It's quite a sight. But I can't help but wonder if all that focus on the external takes away from the internal. Like, are you really connecting with God if you're more worried about whether your scarf is positioned correctly?
That's a great point. It's like obsessing over the choreography of a dance instead of actually feeling the music.
Exactly. And Jesus himself criticized the Pharisees for their outward displays of piety. While their hearts were far from God, he called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of decay on the inside.
Ouch. That's a pretty harsh burn.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that true prayer isn't about performing for God. It's about opening our hearts to him, honestly and authentically.
And it's about finding what helps you personally enter into that space of communion with God, whether it's kneeling, standing, walking, dancing, or even lying down.
As long as your heart is in the right place, right?
Right. Now, to be fair, MCGI does draw on biblical passages to support their teachings on posture and head coverings, but again, it's their interpretation of those passages that's so rigid and restrictive.
Of like taking a beautiful piece of fabric and turning it into a straitjacket.
Exactly. And this focus on outward conformity is a common thread we see. In many groups that exhibit cultic tendencies, it's about control, about creating a sense of us versus them.
We're the only ones who know the right way to pray. Everyone else is doing it wrong.
And that kind of thinking can be really dangerous because it discourages critical thinking and genuine spiritual exploration.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about MCGI's teachings, but what about their actual prayer practices? Do we have any insights into how their members actually pray?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced. While they have all these rules and regulations, there are also glimpses of genuine faith and devotion among their members. We found a clip from one of their services where they're singing a beautiful hymn in Tagalog. The lyrics express deep gratitude to God for his love and mercy.
Can you share some of those lyrics with us?
Sure, they sing, "Pasalamat sa iyong pagmamahal," which means thank you for your love, and later they sing, "Ami yung mga duka mga pinili mo sa iyong bayan," meaning we are the poor, the chosen ones in your nation.
There's a real sense of humility and dependence on God in those words.
It does. And it reminds us that even within groups that have problematic teachings, there can still be individuals who have genuine faith experiences.
It's important to remember that we're not just talking about abstract doctrines here. We're talking about real people with their own personal stories and struggles.
Right. And while we may disagree with MCGI's doctrines, we shouldn't dehumanize their members or dismiss their faith entirely.
It's about finding that balance between critiquing harmful teachings and acknowledging the complexity of human belief.
And it's also important to remember that not everyone within MCGI will necessarily agree with every single teaching or interpretation. There's always a spectrum of belief within any group.
This is not fair to paint everyone with the same brush.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to approach these discussions with nuance and compassion.
All right, so before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, let's recap what we've learned about MCGI's approach to prayer so far.
They place a strong emphasis on outward conformity, with specific rules about posture, head coverings, and avoiding public displays of prayer. They also have a very literal interpretation of the Bible, which leads them to reject practices like the Rosary and to view repetitive prayer as disrespectful to God.
And their teachings often create a sense of fear and anxiety around prayer, suggesting that God only listens to those who have achieved a certain level of righteousness.
But it's also important to acknowledge that even within MCGI, there are individuals who express genuine faith and devotion in their prayers.
Right. It's a reminder that belief is complex, and we should approach these discussions with nuance and compassion.
And on that note, let's take a quick coffee break and come back for the final part of our deep dive into MCGI's Mass Indoctrination Day 3. We'll be exploring the broader implications of their teachings and considering what it all means for us as individuals seeking to deepen our own understanding of prayer.
All right, folks, we're back with our steaming cups of Baracco, ready to tackle the final part of our deep dive into MCGI's Mass Indoctrination Day 3. We've unpacked their specific teachings on prayer, but now I'm curious about the bigger picture. What are the implications of these teachings, not just within MCGI, but in the wider world of faith and belief?
That's a crucial question, and I think MCGI's approach to prayer reveals some uncomfortable truths. about how religion can be used to control and manipulate people. Their emphasis on blind obedience to their interpretation of the Bible creates a system where questioning or dissenting is seen as a direct attack on God himself.
It's like, don't you dare use your own brain. Just listen to what we tell you.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking can be really dangerous because it discourages critical thinking and independent spiritual exploration. It creates an environment where people are afraid to express doubts or ask tough questions or fear of being ostracized or labeled as heretics.
It's like they're building a spiritual echo chamber where only their specific interpretation of faith is allowed to resonate.
And that lack of diversity of thought can be stifling, both for individuals and for the community as a whole. It leads to a very narrow and rigid understanding of faith, one that's often out of touch with the realities of human experience.
Speaking of human experience, I can't help but wonder how MCGI's teachings on prayer might impact their members' personal relationships with God. I mean, their constant emphasis on judgment and punishment, on following all these rules perfectly. It seems like it would create a lot of anxiety and fear.
Absolutely. It's like they're presenting God as this cosmic micromanager, constantly scrutinizing our every move, waiting for us to mess up. And that kind of image can be really damaging, especially for people who are already struggling with feelings of unworthiness or insecurity.
It makes prayer feel more like a performance than a genuine conversation, like you're always on edge, worried about saying or doing the wrong thing.
Right, and that fear can really hinder people from experiencing the true joy and freedom of a loving relationship with God. It can make prayer feel more like a burden than a blessing.
So while MCGI claims to be promoting a biblical understanding of prayer, their teachings might actually be pushing people further away from God.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? Because prayer is meant to be a source of comfort, guidance, and strength. It's about opening our hearts to God, sharing our joys and sorrows, and seeking His wisdom and grace.
It's about recognizing that we're loved and accepted by God, not because we've earned it, but simply because
of His boundless grace and mercy.
Exactly. And that's a message that often gets lost in MCGI's rigid and legalistic approach to faith. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important for us to hold on to that truth, that God is a God of love, not a God of fear. He desires a relationship with us, not a performance. He wants us to come to Him as we are, with all our imperfections and doubts.
And He promises to hear our prayers, not because we've earned His favor, but because He delights in us as His children.
So whether you're a seasoned prayer warrior or just beginning to explore your faith, remember that God is always there, ready to listen and to love you unconditionally.
And that's a message worth holding on to, no matter what other teachings you might encounter.
Well said. And with that, we'll conclude our deep dive into MCGI's Mass Indoctrination Day 3.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
They told me I had to earn my way, 1,000 works for one more day. Endless striving, no rest in sight, chasing shadows in the night. They spoke of rules, they spoke of fear, but the gospel's voice was never clear. A heavy burden I couldn't see, grace was waiting to set me free. Truth and freedom, that's what we need, not chains of works, but grace indeed. Grab your coffee, come take a seat, let's talk of faith, where grace and truth meet.